Although this election cycle was so groundbreaking for women, how can we continue to build off of this progress and work to inspire more women to enter into public service? It is now my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts, so please join me in welcoming on stage Hillary Rosen, a seasoned Democratic strategist who navigates the intersection of media and politics. She is a founding co-chair of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and an on-air CNN political analyst and partner at SKDK Knickerbocker. Also joining her is Kelly Dittmar, assistant professor of political science at Rutgers University and scholar at the Center for American Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Her research focuses on gender in American political institutions. And lastly, Sarah Chamberlain, president and CEO of Republican Main Street Partnership, a network of nearly 80 Republican members of Congress from swing districts who are focused on electing leaders with conservative principles. Joining them on stage today is today's moderator, Kate Martell, the Hill's national political reporter. Kate, over to you.
Thank you, Brittany. We had some fascinating conversations hearing from Republicans and Democrats, and now we have a fantastic...
super polite, right? They were all super polite.
We'll change it.
Yeah.
So now we have a fantastic panel to cap it off and give us some perspective on progress we've made in getting women elected, and I think some of the challenges that we still have. Hillary, I'd like to kick it off with you. That Democratic Party had a pretty historic win in 2018 in certain demographics. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, you know, the caucus speaks for itself. I think the enthusiasm that women had this time, you know, women contributed financially in this election, not just at the polls, but we saw finally for the first time in a while, actually white women voting, you know, in equal percentages for Democrats and Republicans. That really made a huge difference. Women contributed $100 million more in the midterm elections than they did even when Hillary was running for president. So there was just wholesale participation of women, and when you see that across the board, I think these are the results. And you know, when you look at the sort of the partisan divide, I cannot let this go unanswered. I was sitting back there, mouth open, when Virginia Fox said, well, you know, I think that for Republican women, you know, they prefer their domestic duties first before, you know, before others. So it's like, that just sort of says it all.
And Kelly, so we've been talking about how 2018 has been called the year of the woman because of all of these historic changes. And you had an interesting op-ed in the LA Times basically saying that, hey, that's not telling the full story. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be careful. We called 1992 the year of the woman, and then we got all the way up to 20% nearly 30 years later, right? So we have to be careful about saying the job is done in any one single election year. And I would say this year is the same. So we want to celebrate the gains made, and certainly they were significant. But just to give you a couple more sort of pessimistic statistics, women were still less than 25% of all candidates. So when we were talking about the surge of women, they were still less than 25% of the pool. They are more than 50% of the population. They make up less than 30% of office holders at every level of office. And particularly when it comes to the party divide, the job is certainly not done on the Republican side. We saw a drop, as I'm sure Sarah will talk about. We're down to 13 Republican women in the House. The candidate numbers and the percentage of caucuses for Republican women in the House, for example, 6.5% of all Republicans are women. And if we're concerned, and we are at my center, about getting to parity across the board, we're not going to do that on only one side of the aisle. And so I think for me it was, yes, let's celebrate, but let's also use this as a launching point to continue the energy that we saw among donors and participants and candidates to both build and expand that candidate pool and the pool of women who are participating, so that we get much closer to having a more equal voice, greater diversity of women who are running and winning, as well as participating broadly in politics.
Sarah, we just had an opportunity to hear from Carol Miller. She's the only Republican elected to the House, a Republican woman elected to the House. And I know that at Republican Main Street Partnership, you had quite a role in that victory. I was wondering if you could explain your
Sure.
role.
So we're very proud of our one woman that we had. I got to take victory where I can, please. And I just want to say 2 of the women on the stage were members of Main Street. 1 was not. We'll just let you guess who was not. But so Carol, so I'm the only woman in the country that runs an outside organization like this. Carol Miller came to our attention in a primary, and she's obviously a very good candidate, so we supported her from primary up through. We're very pleased with our victory, and I hate to say she's kind of our token new woman, but she is. However, saying that, the men of Main Street, and I'm sorry to say the men, there are a few women, like Elise Stefanik, who's doing her thing, we're very serious now about trying to add more Republican women to the fold. But I have to tell you, I found one in a very good district that should be a Republican district, and it's actually a pro-Trump district. And I talked to the man who lost the race, and he said to me, she's very good, she's tough. But if she was a man, she would be considered tough and strong. But as a woman, we think she's a bitch. I'm like, really? We're still gonna back her and support her because she's a lovely woman and she can win.
Go for it.
Yeah.
You know, the interesting thing about Carol Miller, though, is that, look, she ran on those same issues that the men have run on that district
Yep.
on for 50 years, supporting the coal industry. Like, that's it. That's what you do in that district. And what I find was most interesting about so many of the women who won on the Democratic side is that they ran against the system. They ran for really intense systemic change. They ran kind of against the status quo. And I think that's why women right now are driving the conversation. And I think Republican women, need to join that conversation. I was overwhelmed and moved yesterday when Martha McSally stood, at a sexual assault hearing in the military and joined her voice with survivors of sexual assault. Like, those moments are when women band together and change things. And right now we're seeing more of that energy on the Democratic side. And, God bless us, we have to just keep pushing. But there are like pockets of Republican women, I think, who wanna make progress there. But then you've got like Mitch McConnell, who's held up the sexual assault bill in the military for years, right? So there has to be, I agree with you, there has to be Republicans who will push on the other side on these same issues, but really women have to get more aggressive, not less aggressive in speaking up.
And could I speak to just, I think this speaks to another thing that we saw in the election cycle that Hillary's touched on, which is that we can't measure success for women solely by the numbers, right? So yes, there are these numbers, yes, we could do better, yes, we made history in some ways, but what we also saw was women willing to disrupt the narrative of how you're supposed to run as a woman candidate. I'm supposed to prove I'm tough, I'm strong, I meet these masculine credentials of the job. What you saw, especially on the Democratic side, in part because there was a more receptivity to it, was women saying, I'm gonna run as authentically me, and whatever that means. And so there's a real diversity in the way women ran. They were using different credentials, different backgrounds. It didn't mean that they still weren't meeting some of those standard credentials for the job that we valued in the past. But they, I think, sort of started to push the boundaries so that we can think more broadly about not only what candidates look like, but how they behave and what sorts of credentials they tout as being qualified for office. That's the long-term strategy. The short-term strategy is how do you win now? And campaign strategists, are not, like I'm a scholar sitting, thinking long-term about these things. But so campaign strategists are gonna be like, hey, we got to win this election. But I also hope that there was some recognition that part of what they did was change the landscape for the long term so that we can have all sorts of new types of candidates and new strategies for winning. And I think we might see some of that in the presidential race, sort of at least blend into the ways in which some of the candidates are going to be running there.
So I have a lot of men in Main Street. We already talked about there's only 13 women. And I would tell you, I've gotten them to stop talking about women's issues.
Yeah, right.
Because every issue is a woman's issue. And I tell them, like, oh my God. So we're making some headway, at least with a section of the Republican Party. And my members are the only ones left that live in the suburban districts. Like Brian Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania won, Will Hurd down in Texas, John Katko in New York. They live in districts still that the women, a lot of women, and I was actually in Fitzpatrick's district talking to the women, a lot of the women are like, man, we don't like the tweets, but we like him. And he works across the aisle, so we're still gonna vote for him, and he won by 2.8%. So that's what I'm trying to teach the men. We do a woman-to-woman national tour, get hundreds of women to turn out and say be counted in, and I'm taking the information back to the men and being like, listen, we have to change how we talk as Republicans.
Yeah, you know, I'm going to challenge that a little bit because I actually don't think we're past women's issues, right? I think we're past the abortion argument as being the only woman's issue that matters. But, you know, in my mind, we actually do need a woman's New Deal. We're in this, there are so many women here today. It is a miracle, honestly, in my view, that women have gotten as far as we have. The idea that really, we haven't had equal pay, we haven't had affordable childcare. 2/3 of women on minimum wage are spending 50% of their income on childcare, and yet 50% of the women in this country are actually breadwinners in their family. That's a goddamn miracle as far as I'm concerned. It shows the strength, the intensity, and drive of women. And so I do think that there is this, desire to kind of, let's just go past gender, just kind of like people want, let's just get past race. Let's just all be the same and let's talk about equality. But actually, no, we really do need recognition on what women's issues are. We really do need support for working women. We need support for families. And if women don't drive that conversation, it will not happen.
We have a few more minutes, and then we will come take a few of your questions. So if you want to start thinking of any questions that you might have. And Kelly, I just have to bring this up that, look, President Trump's favorability is pretty historically low among women. We always hear the college-educated white women as being a demographic that switched from voting traditionally Republican to Democratic. And I'm curious, do you think that this is a long-term shift that we're starting to see, or will this be a blip on the radar based on a single politician?
Yeah, and I'm sure Sarah can speak to this because she's doing some on-the-ground polling on this in groups. But I think that what we saw obviously sort of was the flip. There was, particularly among white college-educated women, from 2012 to 2016, to go from supporting Romney by 6 points to supporting Hillary Clinton by 6 points. And then in 2018, that trend continued in terms of support of Democrats among college-educated white women and then college-educated women broadly. But that's a demographic that got sort of a lot of the attention because of the change. Of course, important to this is that women of color have been there all along, right? And in fact, black women were the most reliable voters for Democrats, especially in 2008 and 2012, but also key voters in 2016, and increasingly, of course, Latina voters. So I think the trend is important to pay attention to, and I think it is continuing for college-educated women. But I also think that in there has to be the recognition of, for the Democratic Party particularly, that they cannot take women of color's votes for granted. And too often that has happened. And so there's been really great work by Higher Heights and organizations who have said to the DNC, an open letter to the DNC in 2018, to say, we're the folks who are turning people out, and we're coming out reliably. So speaking to issues, you need to speak to the issues that are important to us. And that means in thinking about women's issues as well, if we're going to call it that we think more broadly. So criminal justice reform and the way it's going to affect certain communities, particularly black women, or talking about immigration and how that might be more important and play a different role in the lives of Latino women or immigrant women. And so I think, there's a broader discussion to have, but I think Sarah might be able to also speak about if you think this trend is continuing.
I hope not. No, I think what's happening is the women, especially the Republican-leaning women, are just looking for a home, and they hate the tweets. They just hate the tweets. And what I'm finding is when we do woman to woman, if he would only tweet less, we like some of his policies. And then there's a whole group of policies that have passed, like right to try and some others, that they have no idea this legislation has passed. Because it's just not breaking through the media with his tweets dominating everything. So I'm hoping that with a different candidate, either in 2 or 4 years, whenever that is, that we can get those women to start paying attention again to the Republican Party and kind of come back home. But I don't see it happening in the very near future.
Did I say?
No, I think it's, I hear you, and I know that, Donald Trump was a significant reason why women were, came out to vote so heavily Democratic in the midterms. On the other hand, I think you were letting the leadership of the Congress, the Republican leadership of the Congress, off the hook when you blame it all on Donald Trump. When they're not talking about these issues either. Like I said, military sexual assault, they're not talking about child care. When Ivanka Trump, for God's sakes, went to the Hill and said, please, just a few $100 million of your $16 billion tax cut should go to affordable child care. They're like, no, we're gonna take it out of investment savings. Like, forget it. We'll pass the policy, we're not gonna pass the money. Like, they actually are doing nothing to make this easier for women either.
Our leadership, and now that, of course, that Paul's gone, like the health care bill in the House was a disaster for the Republican Party. I lost probably 20 to 25 members on the pre-existing conditions.
Yeah.
It was dead in the Senate. Why we had to walk that plank, and I had a lot of members that voted no on it, and they still got targeted with the pre-existing conditions argument. We did nothing to combat that. Our tax bill, we did nothing to go out there and do better PR on it, to really explain what this was. Whether you like it or not, whole different thing, but we needed to explain it better. And you're absolutely right, we didn't focus on a lot of issues. Like right to try, when we dial test that in focus groups, it is off the charts. It is 95 plus. No one talked about that. And what the right to try is, I don't know, probably most of you don't know what it is if you're terminally ill, you have the right to try different types of either chemo or medicines to extend your life. This one's very personal to me because I lost my husband to pancreatic cancer. He worked in the White House, in the Obama White House, and he got an extra 6 months because he got the right to try because he worked for the president. Huge issues out there that we unfortunately didn't talk about.
They are important issues. And I think we have time for maybe one question. Someone from our team will bring a microphone.
Yeah, John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. How many of the freshman class women coming in came from state office, and what are we seeing in terms of more women at the state level that may run in the future?
Well, I can answer from the Republican side. We had one, and she didn't come from the state.
Well,
So
she
there you
did.
go. Well, she did.
She was
That's
from the
true.
state legislature.
She was from the state legislature. So our one came from the state legislature.
Yeah, and I will say that's actually pretty common. So there was also a narrative of like, all these women woke up after Election Day and decided to run for office. And I want to sort of, after 2016 and decided to run for office, a lot of these women were paving the way. What I think 2016 did for some of the women, why we did see the jump, is it was the tipping point. It was like, okay, I've been thinking about it, I'm gonna do it, or the folks who are in the state ledge, there was an opportunity because there were competitive seats. So we did see, I don't have the numbers in front of me, we have it on the Center for American Women in Politics website, about how many were state legislators, but recall too, you had the women on the panel who are also veterans, folks who worked in the administration. So you had a variety of public service backgrounds to most of the women who got elected. Congresswoman Holland was the head of a party. And just to give you a sense of the state legislative level, we saw an increase. We have a record number of women in state legislatures as well. Same story is true. Democratic women won at much higher rates. Republican women's numbers went down. We're at about 28.7% of across the board in terms of state legislators who are women.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and we've already run out of time. So thank you so much. It's been a great panel.